And now we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our LinkedIn live discussion. We had a little bit of technical issues, so we apologize for that, and we hope that this time it's going to work. So if you are using the first link, you need now to use the second link. So please just keep an eye on our LinkedIn page, and you will find out and understand better what I'm talking about. So my name is Hajar Naili. I'm the Director of Communications at Center for Civilians in Conflict, also known as Civic. And this is our first LinkedIn Live. I think you can tell by now. But there is a reason for that. There is a good reason for that. So today we are here to discuss the Protection of Civilians Trends report for the year 2024, which was released last week. And it is Civic signature annual report that tracks the state of civilian protection around the world. But let's be clear, civilians are under attack. With around 130 armed conflicts being fought around the world, a figure that has more than doubled in the last 15 years, civilian harm is on the rise. And this is why we are here today. We are here to discuss what happened in 2024. We are here to discuss the main trends of last year and whatever can be and should be done to reverse the harmful trends. This is the second year that Civic has produced this flagship report, which combines our own analysis and field research with global data provided by our partners at the Institute for Economics and Peace. This report is also truly a collective effort by many Civic colleagues across programs and regions, reflecting a month of research, coordination, and collaboration. So a big kudos, hats off to my colleagues and our partners also around the world. So today I'm delighted for this conversation to be joined by two of my colleagues. Wendy McClinchy, our Director of UN Programs, and Lauren Spink, our Senior Research Advisor at Civic. Both have been directly involved in developing and drafting the report. Welcome to both of you, Wendy and Lauren. So before we start this discussion, I also want to mention that those who are watching can drop their questions in the chat, and we will take them in the second half of this discussion. So let's begin this exchange. And let's look first at the global picture of civilian protection. And I will turn to you first, Lauren. Looking back at the year 2024, what were the major global trends or findings that stood out to you when it comes to civilian harm and protection, and how these trends and findings were different or similar from 2023?
Thanks, Hajar. So the two main points I want to share to kick us off are that nearly all the indicators we have for understanding protection of civilians are moving in the wrong direction. And these trends are the trends we saw this year. They're really a continuation of trends that we saw ongoing last year or beginning last year. And this isn't surprising since there was no resolution to many of the major wars that are driving these trends. So the wars between Russia and Ukraine, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, or within Sudan and Myanmar. And if you break that down into different protection threats or different types of protection concerns for civilians, we saw a 10% increase in civilian casualties over the already horrific 72% increase between 2022 and 2023. So a 10% increase might not sound huge between 2023 and 2024, but if you go back only 2 years, over the last 2 years, there's been a 112% increase in civilian casualties, a more than doubling of civilian casualties. For children alone, there's been a 25% increase in violence against children. We saw in 2024 the highest levels of displacement on record, and expanded attacks on hospitals and schools that will have reverberating effects for years, decades in terms of education and healthcare for civilians. We also saw a huge deterioration in civic space and freedom of the press. These are just some of the issues that the report tackles and that the index looks at in terms of data. And I think some of the overarching and big picture reasons driving these trends, we've seen the use of explosive weapons in populated areas driving a lot of those numbers. If you look at data from Action on Armed Violence, in 2024, 95% of the people killed by explosive weapons were civilians. 95%. That's extraordinary. And we've also seen on the policy side that overall states are not adequately building their foreign policy around a commitment to reducing protection of civilians. So we've seen decreasing commitment to IHL norms, that's international humanitarian law norms, the continued use, as I already said, of explosive weapons in populated areas, arms transfers that are likely to result in high levels of civilian casualties. And I think I'll pause there because I know you've probably got some follow-on questions where we can delve deeper into some of these dynamics.
Thank you, Lauren. This is already that gives us a good picture of what happened in 2024. And we'll come back to the topic of explosive weapons more in detail later in this conversation. But it sounds like we have hit record high in almost most indicators in 2024. So now I want to take it one step ahead. So this year report again features the Civilian Protection Index developed with data from the Institute for Economics and Peace. Could you explain what the index measures, Lauren, and what it revealed more in detail? If you could also do a little bit of a focus on the regions and the countries that saw the biggest deterioration or maybe improvement.
Sure. So the index, the Civilian Protection Index, is comprised of 15 indicators that measure different protection-related phenomena. Some measure physical violence, so civilian casualties, sexual violence. Others measure trust in institutions. Of particular interest to us are trust in military and police. And a third category of indicators that we've bundled look at what we could call a protective environment, aspects of a protective environment. So civic space, freedom of the press, and funding for projects that we would consider linked to protection and peace. Those indicators, we've weighted them differently, with physical protection related indicators weighted the heaviest, trust in the security forces in the middle, and the protective environment, sort of the outer ring of protection, if you think of it that way, weighted the lowest, but all sort of we consider important to the protection situation in countries globally. In terms of some trends, I think overall, North America, as well as the Middle East and North Africa regions, saw the biggest deterioration in the overall bundled civilian protection index in 2024. That deterioration is driven by different issues. So in North America, you're looking at loss of trust in institutions and civic space. In Middle East and North Africa regions, you're looking at more of the physical violence issues linked to some of the wars ongoing in those regions.
Thank you, Lauren. Maybe let's take a step back and Wendy, would you take us to the behind the scene of producing such a report to complete the picture that Lauren just gave us, how it was developed, the kind of data that you used, even though Lauren mentioned some of them, the collection of stories also from affected countries. So if you could provide a little bit background around this, Wendy.
Sure, thanks, Hajar, and hello, everyone. The genesis for the report originally started as a complementary piece of research and analysis to the UN Secretary General's annual Protection of Civilians report, which really showcases how several of these trends are moving across time on a year-by-year basis. But there were some limitations with that. And we wanted to provide a more holistic picture of a broader range of risks and be able to do it in a way that really puts civilian voices at the center of it. And that really informed how we designed and developed methodology for the report and the index itself. We wanted it to be quantitative, so really having sort of a rigorous sort of analysis of the numbers where data is available, and that's really a huge challenge in these spaces. But also do it in a way that showcases the personal stories, the voices of those who are really on the front line and most impacted by the conflicts themselves. That's a little bit the overview. So we developed this partnership with Institute for Economics and Peace, which has a really great global peace index and a number of other indices. And that's the basis. And we framed it around the different areas of harm, really, that Civic itself is dedicated to working on resolving. So recognizing, preventing, protecting, and amending harm from conflict. So a little bit of the background. Over.
Thank you, Wendy. Definitely, this report fits very well into the mission of Civic, which is to bring attention to the protection of civilians, but also do something about it. So this report ultimately is not just to sit on shelves, but it serves a purpose. Could you speak of the purpose? How do we want this report to be used, and by whom?
Yeah, thanks, Hajar, because indeed that's exactly why we came up with it. I mean, we in Civic have a theory of change that has proven quite effective in that we work directly with frontline communities in areas most affected by conflict. We use empirical research to sort of complement that experience with those communities and our engagement with armed actors, and we feed that sort of upstream into the policy space. And much of that is at the multilateral level, but also at the multinational and the sort of regional levels. So with that in mind, our target audience is really about those who are making decisions, which have these huge consequences for civilians. I mean, at the moment now, we are at a time where Europe is rearming in a very major way. States, militaries are shifting budgets quite substantially from humanitarian aid to security spending. And this has huge implications for those who are most at risk, who are struggle to meet basic needs, leaving them more vulnerable to the risks that we're talking about today. And so for us, I think really as these global leaders make very consequential decisions for people's lives, we wanted to make sure that those decisions were informed by a very clear analysis of what the human cost of those decisions are and what the human cost of war is. There's been a lot of ongoing reform efforts happening in different multilateral institutions. It is really a period of quite a bit of turmoil. And so again, as those shifts happen, whether it's a UNAT, as member states are looking at implementing the Pact for the Future, this review now that's happening for the review of peace operations, we really want to make sure that all of the institutions making those decisions are prioritizing protection of civilians across, human rights, peace and security, humanitarian disarmament work, and that the donors that have been supporting those programs have an understanding of these trends as well, so that they can really invest in human security-centered approaches, ones that really prioritize protection, conflict prevention, humanitarian mediation, and peace building, all areas that we touch on in the report.
Thank you, Wendy. Now I want maybe to focus more on overlooked and neglected crises. And so the report shines the spotlights on countries like Sudan and Haiti. These places, these conflicts often receive less global attention. So why was it important for us to bring attention to these crises, to highlight these countries in the report? And maybe you can speak also of the finding in a way to try to bring again attention to these places that are overlooked and neglected. Wendy, do you want to maybe take that question?
Sure, thanks, Hajar. I mean, Sudan has been a really extreme example of where the risks to civilians have really skyrocketed. It's also a context where getting reliable data on the harm to civilians has been extremely difficult for all of those working in our sector. I think especially as we've seen the means of warfare become more lethal for civilians by design. So the continued use of air and drone strikes, ground attacks on civilian homes, on civilian infrastructure, on schools, on healthcare systems, and real impunity by those committing the crimes. I mean, Haiti also, we've struggled to get political attention to these, to that very protracted crisis. And in part, it's because where there is lack of media attention, there is also a lack of sort of political attention, right? These things do go hand in hand. There's also an implication in terms of funding, right? So we've seen a huge drop in this past year in peace building aid. And this was, if we remember that this measure was only in 2024, so it was really before the humanitarian reset, sort of UNAT and the big cuts to the UN system and the dismantling of US aid. But we could already see in those contexts, as well as globally, this indicator that that meant that even for conflicts that are visible, that the getting resources to them has been inversely trending to the risks, right? So while the risks are going much higher, the resources to support humanitarian aid and protection are dropping substantially, I mean, significantly. And these are, as we said in the beginning, really moving in the wrong direction. In Haiti, we have a feature on how the gang violence has led to really thousands of deaths and a humanitarian crisis that is really enormously underfunded. The UN Security Council has really, I think, struggled with mandating an operation there, which again was struggling with funding issues. Myanmar, you sort of hardly hear about anymore, even though the risks continue to be very high there. Mali, we've lost the peacekeeping mission there, but the civilian harm trends continue to increase. But these aren't necessarily conflicts that you hear about. So one of the purposes of this report was also to make sure that we showcase where the risks to civilian harm continued and continue to rise, even if they weren't in public attention.
Thank you, Wendy. So we are speaking of risks, and I want us to shift attention to emerging and evolving threats. So we are seeing how new technology, from AI to drones, the spread of disinformation, as well as climate change, are reshaping how conflict affects civilians. Lauren, I want to turn to you, since you just authored a piece on AI and drone, which will be published soon by Just Security, and you also led research on disinformation. Can you tell us more on these type of emerging and evolving threats, especially AI, automated weapons, and disinformation as well?
Sure, Hajar. So I think the overarching headline is that technology is continuing to drive new protection concerns, and policymaking, governance, norm development are not keeping up, right? So if we look at the issue of drones, prior to 2024, there was, from around 2020, I think a slow buildup of drone use. But 2024, you see a bit of a step function in terms of a break in the scale of development with the past. According to ACLA data, there was a 4-fold increase in drone strikes in conflict settings in 2024 as compared to 2023. In 2010, only 3 states were known to have drone capabilities. Now over 40 states have this capability, and over 90 non-state armed groups do. So this is a huge expansion in the ability of actors able to use drones, and in some cases using drones. And that does lead to civilian harm. It also leads to civilian harm that's more obvious sometimes in terms of civilian casualties, but it also can lead to a huge mental burdens for civilians who are living under the constant hum of drones above them, not knowing when or if there might be an attack or a strike against them. And it also has implications for accountability. With the types of drones being used now, very small commercially available drones that you can purchase on Amazon, accountability can really be a challenge, determining who is responsible and for civilians to seek redress of some kind from those attacks. AI is being increasingly embedded into the military domain with, in some cases, extremely minimal safeguards. New AI technology is being tested on battlefields, Ukraine and Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory, and they're being marketed as, battlefield tested. But what does that mean? We have little understanding of the civilian harm that might be arising from the deployment of AI and new weaponry, AI in the military domain for decision-making and targeting. There has been steady attention and statements from, for example, the United Nations on these issues over the past few years, from member states leading gatherings of their peers to try and set and shape norms. But progress really does feel incremental compared to the pace of the technological developments. I think maybe just a quick comment on disinformation. It's harder to measure than drone attacks. It is really hard to look at how and when and where disinformation is increasing, but it does seem to be in many regions of the world, certainly Asia, Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa, based on our indicators, the main indicator we looked at on this for the report. And it has implications that I think we often don't immediately notice or see, but that are critical. Civilians trying to make life and death decisions about whether or not to evacuate, about whether or not to go to a shelter, about where to seek humanitarian aid and food, are being targeted with disinformation, and sometimes exposed to misinformation that undermines their protection, their decision making.
Thank you, Lauren. I just want to repeat these numbers for our audience because they're quite telling of how quickly the use of drone is expanding in the battlefield. You said in 2010, only 3 states had drone capabilities. Now over 40 states have this capability, and over 90 non-state actors do right now. So this is quite significant, and this is definitely an area to watch. I want to turn to Wendy now. Civic conducted a couple of research a few years ago on climate change, the intersection of climate change, protection of civilians, conflict, environmental degradation in Iraq and Yemen. And again, this threat of climate change is highlighted and featured strongly in this report. Could you share what are the findings this year, Wendy?
Thanks, Hadra. Unfortunately, the news is not very good. And while political leaders may be turning their attention away from climate change in some instances, the threat continues to grow, and it's much worse in some regions than in others. I mean, we know that in the Sahel, the onset of warming is 1.5 times faster than the global average. And what we continue to see is this relationship between where climate change acts as a risk multiplier that deepens vulnerabilities and undermines adaptation capacity by people. And when this is and it can basically add to the conditions on that, the causal conditions for conflicts around the world. So climate shocks also are deepened by and deepen sort of natural disaster and drive displacement and insecurities. So some of the data that came out is based on data from IDMC. We know that almost all, so it's all but 4 of the 49 contexts where civilians were displaced by conflict, they were also displaced by disasters, and that the number of countries reporting both types of displacements have tripled since 2009. We know that women and girls are often driven into gendered sort of high-risk coping strategies. So we know that the effects of this are worse for them. So for example, in Ethiopia, almost half of all refugee women surveyed in 2024 by UNHCR reported sexual violence while traveling increasingly longer distance to collect firewood. We've done research in South Sudan that looked at the implications of the migration and grazing patterns of herder and farmer communities, something we've also seen in the Sahel, and the effects that can have for conflict in already very vulnerable regions. We've seen in how it has both state and non-state armed groups have sometimes also deployed hunger as a tool of war, and this is something that's also deepened by climate change. They do this by laying siege to civilian areas, preventing the delivery of life-saving food, and they do this as a sort of man-made hunger. A man-made sort of hunger phenomena, which is, a violation of international humanitarian law. We've seen in Iraq how recruitment by armed non-state groups has been increased because of loss of livelihoods related to climate risks, where risk of exploitation by armed groups, by traffickers, and other criminal networks also prey on these. I want to just mention, if I could, two other quick sort of phenomena that have really become quite pronounced in the last year. One is the increase in aid worker deaths. And here there's really quite a shocking sort of spike. We've seen this in contexts like Gaza, but also elsewhere. This year it was 383 aid workers killed and 308 wounded. It's really the highest on record and much higher from the previous year. And almost 97% of those killed were nationally recruited. So as we're thinking about in the humanitarian community, what does sort of localization mean, and trying to localize our programming, we also have to think about the risks. I mean, the risks to local and national staff have never been higher than they are now. The other trend is explosive weapons use, which we mentioned briefly in the beginning, which is really taking a significant toll on civilian lives and is often the payload that is carried by the kind of drones that Lauren was just describing. So those risks are, again, moving in the wrong direction, and they're highest in Lebanon, Myanmar, Syria, and Ukraine, but also in other contexts.
Thank you for mentioning these two additional emerging trends, Wendy. The report also talks about justice, accountability, and the importance of making amends for civilian harm. Amend is an area that is central to the work we've been doing at Civic, but it's also a difficult area because accountability and amends require recognition. So how much accountability have we seen in 2024 for civilian harm? And maybe if Wendy or Lauren, you can speak of what factors made accountability for civilian harm more difficult to achieve. Wendy, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll start, and then maybe Lauren, you can pick up. I mean, maybe I'll start with the difficult factors, and then try to look at points of progress. I mean, accountability is always one of the key challenges across protection of civilians work. It's the factors that affect it or that make it difficult are lack of reliable data, which we've already spoken about. We talked about Sudan. The lack of casualty figures there is really obscuring the scale of humanitarian needs, but it's not only there. It's harder to get resources when we don't know what the needs are, and many of the humanitarian appeals in the areas where risks to civilians are highest are really to say chronically underfunded is an understatement. We know that conflict-related sexual violence remains a significant source of harm, but the data on that is also very low and always difficult to get. Funding affects accountability sort of pathways, because if you look at the downsizing in the humanitarian sector for reporting and investigation on violations, for example, some of the key areas that we're already seeing major shortcomings of, we won't have the data to be able to prosecute the crimes, despite the upward sort of trends in some of these crimes. And I would say also political attention. As I mentioned earlier, if it's not on the sort of political agenda of decision-making bodies, including the Security Council, then it's very difficult to help create accountability pathways. This siloing between the justice and that sort of peace and security and human rights sectors remains there, and trying to find ways to work together for sort of early warning pathways and for accountability pathways remains a priority, and something that we're working on among others. all of this is happening in the context of real backsliding on international legal commitments. So one example is the transfer of anti-personnel landmines from the US to Ukraine, even though their transfer and use was prohibited by the Otto Convention. We know from data that there's more cluster munitions which are being produced and transferred. So, but if you're pulling out of the international treaties, then accountability pathways becomes very, very difficult. And for this reason, I think we're seeing a lot more of these initiatives that are non-binding, but political initiatives to try and consolidate political support. So, for example, the political declaration on explosive weapons, the Safe Schools Declaration, right? So we can try to create other pathways. There are also a rise in actors that are not accountable; they're not state actors. So the use of mercenaries and private military companies are quite often used by states to evade accountability. There are some points of progress as well, but maybe, Lauren, you want to touch on any other points I missed, and I'm glad to come back to that.
Maybe just to take a step back and say that at Civic, we recognize that initial harms often, if unaddressed, fester. Something like a destroyed school, as I mentioned earlier, or a destroyed hospital, there will be reverberating effects of that for years. And so when we think about addressing harm, we think about it in terms of more acute and immediate physical harm, as well as what will be, the ripple effect of this harm for years if nothing is done to address it. And as Hajar mentioned, there's accountability, but Civic, we also work on the issue of amends, which is an effort to recognize and potentially offer redress for harm, whether or not there has been a violation. So whether or not a civilian casualty or civilian harm was in violation of IHL, we still work with actors to try and work on efforts to recognize and offer some type of support or compensation for potentially for that harm. So our report this year, for example, looks at the real absence of amends, unfortunately, in Afghanistan, and also how current political dynamics, current opposition to refugees is causing the push of Afghani refugees from other countries back to Afghanistan, where the current political and human rights environment has seen a massive deterioration, and where harms committed over decades of violence have not been adequately and fully addressed, and what that means for civilians in terms of their lives and their coping. I think I think if we're looking for bright spots, there are some. I don't know that they're in amends. I mean, so we saw, in 2024, there were some member states who continued to put in place some mechanisms to recognize and address civilian harm. For years, for the last, I think since 2022, the U.S. government has been working on a civilian harm mitigation response and action plan, and a Department of Defense initiative there to support it. In 2024, there was progress implementing the CHMRAP and the DoDI. But I know we're supposed to be talking about 2024, not 2025, but if we look forward, that commitment and progress is now in question. So it looks like progress in 2024, but if I know what I know now sitting here, it's hard to call it progress when we see some of those commitments dropping off. This year, there was progress by the Netherlands in establishing a reporting mechanism for civilians, for civilian casualties. I think that's a bright spot. Beyond amends, we've also tried to highlight some other bright spots. So we've tried to look at how states are operationalizing POC and when and where states have taken IHL principles or protection of civilians standards and put those into practice. Like, what does it look like to have a foreign policy or a military policy that embraces protection of civilians? And so, I mentioned the Netherlands and the U.S. efforts around civilian harm mitigation. We also, we saw a protection of civilians policy in Iraq that was approved in 2024. and a code of conduct that was put in place in some governorates in Yemen. So these are examples of efforts by states to operationalize protection of civilians. Civic has also worked with has worked in Nigeria for years on some of these issues, and we saw protection of civilians training efforts, their efforts by the security forces to engage with civilians and change their behavior or actively protect civilians from outside threats. So I think we do see these positive examples of it, and the report has a few spotlight articles that try to highlight what positive protection action looks like, whether for amends or for mitigating civilian harm, preventing and mitigating civilian harm before it happens.
Thank you, Lauren. Wendy, did you have anything else to add? We're good. Okay, I just want to remind our audience as you're watching that we will take a few questions in a few minutes. So please feel free to drop your question in the chat. If you don't see your questions, we do see them. I just want to let you know. So the report concludes with a roadmap for action. I must say, when I saw these action items, it means that there is a lot of work to do. And that's just the reality. And we just heard from you, Lauren and Wendy. The picture is quite bleak, if we put it bluntly. So now, given how little responsive some governments and armed actors have been in simply understanding that they should not target civilians or send weapons to being used against civilians, I want us maybe to, just for the sake of this conversation, to focus on 2-3 top priorities that we would like to see compliance with in 2025 and beyond. Wendy, do you want to start?
Sure. I think so. I'll start at how about I start with the multilateral sphere, and maybe Lauren, you can pick up a few of the state-based ones, just given the areas of overlap. I mean, I think that one of the focus areas should be, so we have many recommendations in the report. I think trying to embed the protection of civilians in whatever the future of UN peace operations looks like is going to be incredibly important. So even if we're not going to have large sort of multidimensional stabilization peacekeeping missions because of budget cuts, attacks on peacekeepers and aid workers, diminishing political space, that whatever the presence look like should have a POC mandate at the center, because that really is what peacekeeping sort of is derived from and is about. And so as the UN is taking forward all of these discussions, there's a whole week next week in New York dedicated to recommendations in this regard. That would be one of my suggestions for a top priority. I would say also trying to restore political will for and among states, including sort of security partnered states, for international treaties, international conventions that we know have protected civilians in the past, whether it's on landmines, explosive weapons use, arms transfers, lethal autonomous weapons systems. There really has to be a sort of a proactive stance. We can't take for granted anymore the progress that we've made over the past decades. We have to take a sort of proactive defense posture to advocate for POC at the sort of political level, and if that has to happen outside of some of the, the mandates in some of these institutions, if there's not political space, then that should happen between and among states. Maybe I pass it to Lauren for a few others.
Wendy, I totally agree with you, though, on the top priorities and some of the points that I would highlight. We said explosive weapons in populated areas are driving a significant number of these trends. So the political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas lays out what states can do to avoid this type of civilian harm. I mean, really actively implementing that for the states that are signatory and states that aren't signatory joining this effort. The transfer of weapons to states, being done with consideration for how those weapons will be used and whether they'll be used to commit IHL violations. Really getting ahead of the technology issues, or at least catching up with the technology issues, right? I mean, it can't just keep being kicked down the road. Like what we will do in terms of state behavior norms and regulations around these technologies that are now on battlefields, that are being used for planning and decision making. These, I think, are some of my top priorities from our list. But it could be viewed as, a long or overwhelming roadmap. But it's meant to be a roadmap, right? It's meant to be helpful and a guide. And beyond those top priorities, I would just point to the operationalization of POC that I already mentioned. These, we're talking about the bigger picture policy issues, but also at the operational and tactical levels, there's a lot that militaries can be doing to learn from each other to operationalize POC and civilian harm mitigation.
Thank you, Lauren and Wendy. I want to turn to our audiences now and take a few questions. And surprisingly, the topic of drone is getting a lot of attention. And we have a question. Are the drones supplied from a single country? Can we speak of any information? I know Civic focuses a lot on the arm transfer, and we keep track of the countries that are sending and shipping weapons. What about drones? Lauren, do you want to take that question?
Sure. So the drones are not coming from a single country. They are coming from a variety of countries. The top countries are Turkey, the United States, China, Russia, Israel, the UK, Iran, India, France, and Germany. That's the top list. But I think what is even more remarkable than the list of countries, selling drones is this overall trend in proliferation, right? We went from having these massive, extremely high-tech drones that very few people had access to a handheld item that can be commercially purchased for a few $1,000s. We went from millions of dollars for a drone, or at least many tens of thousands of dollars for a drone, to a few $1,000s that can be purchased online, and what that means for proliferation. And even that small drone online can be outfitted with a weapon that can cause harm. And I think also we're seeing a growing number of countries domestically producing their own drones, or being willing to resell drones that they have purchased from one of these top producers. So there's all kinds of dynamics there that are feeding into this proliferation of drones. But it's not, one single country. There's a growing number of countries who have access to the technology for a variety of these reasons.
Thank you, Lauren. And a little plug that you have an opinion piece that will be published in the coming days by Just Security on this exact topic, if anyone from our audience is interested in learning more. Another question is about, so what do you think is the danger of chemical use in bombardment? For example, in South Sudan, where chemicals were used to bombard civilian areas, what do you think would be the danger in the long run in civilian populated settlement? So do we have anything about the use of chemical weapons in this report, Wendy, Lauren, that we can speak of?
There is not a focus on chemical weapons in the report. I think this falls into the category, though, of an increasing lack of adherence to international humanitarian law, or a growing disregard for international humanitarian law. And I think one thing we've also recognized in our annual report, especially last year, was that weapons like this have an impact on civilians immediately, but also there is environmental damage that can come from the use of these weapons that has reverberating effects for civilians. And so I think in terms of the question and the long-term impacts, there's immediate impacts, there's medium-term health impacts, and there's long-term environmental impacts that result from using some of these weapons, which is why they are, prohibited under international law, many of these weapons. And so, or why states have signed on to treaties limiting the use of these weapons, why there are norms against the use of them. And so, I think that's mainly what I could say. Wendy, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I mean, maybe in terms of proactive things that can be done to mitigate it. I mean, whether the risk is from chemical weapons or other sorts of weapons, so landmines, explosive weapons. I mean, some of the pathways for protection are shared, right, between them. So, and we spoke about many of those today. So, accountability, really trying to create pathways and support accountability and amends for civilian harm, when it does happen. We haven't had a lot of time to talk about inclusion, so involving survivors of harm is including and especially, I think, marginalized groups from society that are quite often more vulnerable to the risks that we've been talking about today. But we've also seen that when they're involved in justice and reconciliation mechanisms, there are better outcomes sort of overall, and it rebuilds that sort of social contract between the state and civilians. And I think in that regard, also sort of making sure that there is the right kind of training, preparedness, and support to states who do bear the responsibility to protect their own civilians, as well as these safeguards that we were speaking about earlier. I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet that is really important is having dialogue with some of the producers of these weapons system. In conversations like this one, we don't often have those actors in the room, and it's not been a common practice, I think, in our sector to have, to have these sort of ties for understandable reasons, I think, or these dialogue pathways for sort of weapons producers. And I think that especially with the technology the threats from technology that Lauren was mentioning earlier, this might be another area that could benefit from a bit more attention. The same thing goes for landmines and explosive remnants of wars, which, as Lauren said, continue to bear harm for years after they're first used.
We'll take a last question. What are the practical points of action, and how can we ensure civilian protection during such a type of crisis or attacks? I'm not clear about the question, but I want to use that question. We have spoken about actions that should be taken to protect civilians during that discussion. Maybe I will use that question actually to bring attention to how local communities and civilians themselves organize for their own protection. And this is also a section that is featured in this report.
Yeah, I can come in on this first. So we do have in the report a spotlight article on community-based protection. This is an activity that Civic supports in the countries, in many of the countries where we work. And what we've seen with community-based protection is that it can improve the security and the situation for civilians, even in the absence of a wider or more comprehensive peace. And so we, for example, have seen, I started to mention this earlier in Nigeria, but, like community protection groups engaging with the Nigerian Armed Forces, and that leading to the Nigerian Armed Forces changing their patrol routes, providing additional patrols for civilians to locations where they're being attacked. We have seen in Ukraine, for example, working with communities to put in place like crisis plans with authorities so that there's a clear understanding of who will take action and what civilians should do as the situation escalates potentially in different communities. The security situation deteriorates in certain communities. So I think what is possible depends on the specifics of a particular context, the conflict dynamics, those community dynamics, but there are a lot of gains that can be made by working at that level with communities and supporting them to put in place the protection strategies that they think are most critical or will be most successful, and in their engagement directly with armed actors when it is safe to do so, when they consider it safe to do so. So yes, I think that is one avenue of potential progress. Certainly, we all believe that on this, but among the three of us working for Civic, it's a core of what we do. And I think that is, one area of additional investment in local communities that can bear fruit.
Thank you, Lauren. And maybe, Wendy, you want to add also a couple of words. I know you've been looking closely at the role of peacekeeping forces. With the withdrawal of peacekeeping forces, there is also a role for communities to engage, especially if there is a vacuum. Do you want to speak of that?
Sure. We actually put out a piece of research earlier this year with the Global Protection Cluster and the Norwegian Refugee Committee on protection gaps left in the drawdown in the context of peacekeeping drawdowns. And there's a whole set of recommendations that include sort of community-based protection, what it should look like for humanitarian actors, and many other areas. Some of the key areas I think that we have seen very good results when communities are supported in around early warning mechanisms. Where they basically communities can operate a sort of community alert network. We've seen those work well when they're supported in Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. But when the UN support for some of these mechanisms withdraws, there isn't always national and local capacity to continue those. So prioritizing some of these pathways for protection at the local level, again, where risks are highest and where there may not be a continued presence of humanitarian actors, is a priority, I think, that we've seen across different points of research for us. I'd also say sort of civil military dialogue. We have a new report that's just come out from Ukraine that shows how vital it's been for keeping civilians safe in that horrific war that continues there. And really this function of sort of CIMIC within the Ukrainian Defense Forces has been really instrumental in linking up some of those community protection groups with military sort of operational decision making in a way that has saved lives. So I'd maybe suggest those a couple of areas.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Lauren, for this discussion and all your insights today. Thanks also to everyone who joined us online. You can download and read the full Protection of Civilians Trends report for the year 2024 on our website at civiliansinconflict.org. Once again, thank you for being part of this discussion, and we look forward to continuing it in the weeks and months ahead.